At Racetrack Playa in Death Valley National Park, rocks leave long tracks across a dry lakebed even though no one sees people or animals pushing them. That is the first concrete clue. The trails are real. The rocks are real. The landscape is real. And for decades, the movement was not directly observed. Then in the winter of 2013, researchers finally watched the stones move. Confirmed, the sailing stones can move naturally. Disputed, older explanations that needed supernatural force, magnetism, or impossible winds. Interpretive, the mystery survived because the solution required rare timing, not a hidden monster. Here is the key mechanism before the first minute. The stones move when a shallow winter pond forms on the playa, freezes into thin sheets of ice, and then begins to break apart under sun and light wind. The ice panels shove the rocks slowly across soft mud. The stones leave trails behind them. That answer sounds simple only after you know it. Before the cameras and GPS units, it was hard to prove. Because the conditions are rare. The playa has to flood. The water has to freeze. The ice has to be thin enough to move. And the wind has to arrive at the right moment. The setting matters. Racetrack Playa is a dry lakebed in Death Valley National Park, a place that looks almost designed for a mystery. A flat clay surface. Sparse stones. Mountain walls. Extreme weather. And a silence that makes every track look impossible. Confirmed, the tracks appear on a smooth playa surface. Interpretive, the visual power comes from contrast. A heavy rock sits at the end of a trail, and the human brain asks the obvious question. Who moved it? For years, the guesses were everywhere. Strong wind. Slick mud. Ice rafts. Magnetism. Pranks. Even supernatural force. The problem was not that every idea was foolish. The problem was that the stones moved rarely, sometimes years apart, and usually when no scientist was standing there at the exact moment. Tracks are evidence after the event. But tracks alone do not show the mechanism. That is why the mystery lasted so long. The scene was easy to photograph and hard to catch in action. The breakthrough came when researchers placed GPS-equipped rocks, time-lapse cameras, and weather instruments on the playa. Then the rare combination finally happened. In December 2013, they observed rocks moving during a shallow winter pond event. The movement was not fast. It was slow enough to miss if you expected drama. Thin ice panels broke apart and drifted across the water. As they pushed into rocks, the stones slid across the mud and carved trails. That is the key scientific moment. The mystery did not end because someone guessed correctly. It ended because the event was measured while it happened. The mechanism is called ice shove. First, rain or runoff creates a shallow pond on the playa. Second, cold night temperatures freeze that water into thin floating ice. Third, morning sun weakens and breaks the ice into panels. Fourth, light wind pushes those panels across the water. Fifth, the moving ice presses against rocks and slides them through wet mud. Finally, the water dries and leaves the trail preserved. Confirmed, ice, water, wind, and mud can move the stones. Interpretive, the beauty of the solution is that no single ingredient is enough. The mystery is the recipe. Even after the explanation, the tracks still look impossible. That is because the moving force disappears. The water evaporates. The ice melts. The wind stops. The mud dries. All that remains is a rock and a path. The cause leaves no obvious body at the scene. That is why the sailing stones are such a perfect natural mystery. They show the aftermath of a rare event, not the event itself. The landscape is a crime scene where the culprit melts away. So is the mystery solved? Mechanically, yes. The direct observations showed how rocks can move. But solved does not mean boring. The remaining wonder is probability. How often do all conditions line up? Why do nearby rocks sometimes travel differently? How do ice panels break and steer? Why do some tracks stay straight while others change direction? The basic mechanism is confirmed. The fine details still make the playa worth studying. That is the difference between a debunk and a real explanation. The sailing stones keep drawing attention because the image explains itself instantly. A rock. A trail. An empty desert. No visible mover. That is a perfect thumbnail mystery. It works in 1 second. But the full story rewards patience. The answer requires winter water, nighttime freezing, morning melt, thin ice, low friction, light wind, and mud that records the motion after the evidence disappears. That is why the story cannot stop at dramatic desert shots. The sequence matters. Water appears. Ice forms. Wind arrives. Then the moving force disappears. What proved the case? Not a single photograph of a track. The stronger proof came from instruments working together. GPS movement. Time-lapse imagery. weather data, water and ice conditions, and direct observation of rocks moving during the rare event. That matters for every mystery we cover. A strange result starts the question, but measurement closes the loop. The sailing stones are a model for how a mystery should be solved without making it smaller. The most important word in a solution is not ice. It is stack. The conditions have to stack together. The playa needs enough water to create a shallow pond, but not so much that the rocks vanish under deep water. The night has to get cold enough to freeze a thin sheet, but not so cold that the ice becomes too thick and locked in place. The morning sun has to weaken the ice. The wind has to move it. The mud has to be soft enough to record the track, but firm enough to preserve it. That is why people could stare at the aftermath for decades and still miss the event. The process is natural, but the timing is narrow. This is also why the sailing stones are useful for understanding mysteries. Not every mystery needs to remain unexplained to be popular. Sometimes the explanation is the strange part. People notice it because the image looks impossible. They remember it because the evidence chain is satisfying. The twist is that the real answer is not weaker than the legend. It is more specific. It gives us a desert lake that appears only sometimes. Ice thin enough to float and break. Wind gentle enough to look harmless. And stones that leave tracks after the entire mechanism disappears. That is not a debunk. That is nature being quietly theatrical. There is also a conservation card. Racetrack playa is fragile. Vehicle tracks, footprints, or moved stones can damage the surface and confuse the evidence. That matters because the playa is not just scenery. It is the recording medium. The mud is the archive. If people disturb it, they are not just spoiling a view. They are damaging the natural record that makes the phenomenon legible. So the responsible version of the story includes wonder, science, and restraint. Look at the stones. Do not become the force that moves them. The real mystery of the sailing stones is not that science failed. It is that nature built a process so rare and quiet that it looked impossible until the right tools waited long enough. The stones do not need ghosts. They need water, ice, wind, mud, sun, and timing. That is more elegant than the legend. Because it means the desert was not hiding magic. It was hiding a mechanism. If the sailing stones made you rethink solved mysteries, stay with the Mystery Atlas TV. We follow cases where the answer is real, but the evidence journey is still worth the chase. For Racetrack Playa, what amazes you more? The moving rocks, the ice shove solution, the rare timing, or the fact that the culprit melts away before most people arrive? Tell me which part still feels impossible. Evidence check. The Racetrack Playa case is powerful because it shows how a mystery can become more interesting after the mechanism is found. Thin ice, shallow water, and light wind can move stones, but that does not make the sight less strange. It gives the strangeness a working model. The better question is how often the conditions align, why some stones move while others stay still, and how a desert floor can preserve tracks long enough to look impossible. The solution does not erase the wonder. It turns the wonder into a rare natural event with evidence behind it.